mentioned to you last week, page 4. 21 nations condemn Syrian blood libel accusations. It's recommended reading a valuable book called The Matzah of Zion by Syrian Defense Minister Mustafa Tlass, which justified ritual murder charges brought against the Jews in Damascus. And they're talking about Damascus 1840. And this book is coming out now. If you remember what I read to you about one of the charges against the witches was sacrificial infanticide, the killing of a child. And it's next step to the killing of the child for the blood to mix in the matzahs, which is the blood libel. And it's alive today. When it gets in the floor, it's very, very tough to extirpate. So, for those of you who are really interested in the subject and want to know current things, you'll find in the Jewish press, in the Jewish Bulletin, stuff you will not find on the pages of the regular newspapers. So,
up there on the table that are here just for that purpose.
Oh, okay, I didn't know that. The 18th, this one.
That's what I was going to.
Okay, great.
We also have these for people who want to get.
Right, yes. If you want to subscribe, Mr. Harris has it. Okay. Another thing, some of you have been trying to get the tapes of the previous lectures from the library, and there was a little bit of a mix-up, but it's all straightened out. There are four of them ready for circulation now, and there shouldn't be any more problem throughout the rest of the semester.
Next week, or last week's will be there Thursday afternoon. If you want to go last week, will be there this Thursday.
Okay. Another thing, another date to remember. As you know, as most of you know, every year we have a memorial here, a Yom HaShoah memorial, as close to the official memorial date as possible. This year, it's April 7th, and it will be announced around the campus. But in addition to that, we have been honored on Sunday, April 14th, the following Sunday. There's a Northern California-wide Yom HaShoah memorial at the Memorial Pavilion, where for those of you who know where the statues are, in San Francisco, in Lincoln Park, sponsored by all the B'nai Bridge lodges and units in Northern California. And the director of our center, Dr. Steiner, has been asked to be the keynote speaker. So we hope we'll find time to come down that following Sunday to participate in the memorial. Two others will, from the Alliance and the Center will be actually participating. Myself and, okay, well, we will also have, hopefully, a survivor from Sonoma County to light one of the candles. Pardon? The Lincoln Park, yeah. In front of the Legion of Honor, yeah. It's possible to organize it. We have enough time in advance, so we didn't. We'll have carpools. Just ask. Okay. For everything now.
Okay, I have some.
Oh, you have some. Go ahead, John.
The papers are due for the sociology, education, and some other people whose papers we have to read, so they are ready and graded. And then I also wanted to tell you that one of the basic books which are to be read or should be read is the Reflections on Experiences. And those of you who still haven't had it, it is available just up front. That is not up front up there. And then we have a handout which some of you have not received, which is a number of important basic informative notions, and those of you who have not received it, we can also give it to you up there after lecture series.
Okay. Dr. Yeager will now.
Can I just make
Yeah, go ahead.
For those people who turned in history papers, if you turn them in before today, I have the paper for you to get back. If you haven't turned it in yet, please turn it in as quickly as you can.
And people who are signed up for the Holocaust lecture series under German 380 should know that their first paper is due today. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, here's a syllabus. And if you come to see me afterwards and plead for mercy.
Any more other announcements from the floor? Okay. Dr. Yeager will now introduce today's panel. You have a microphone with a lectern right there.
They all work here, yes. Well, all right. We'll let me just tell you a little bit about our two panelists. I won't go on and on. It's I'm sorry that Miss Sarah Heuderberger's name has been misspelled. Yes, and it was. I think we spelled it Heuderberger, and then it should be Heuderberger, right? All right. So now you all know. All right. She studied economics in Munich, has an MA in economics, and she studied Jungian psychotherapy at the School for Existential Psychology. She's also a graduate of San Francisco State University, where she got a degree in clinical psychology in '85. And I think the thesis here would be of some interest to you, which is psychotherapy with survivors of the Holocaust. And Ms. Heuderberger continues to work with survivors of the Holocaust. About half of her clients are survivors, and she works at the Jewish Family and Children's Services in San Francisco. And she also works with an organization that is very difficult to pronounce. It says Tikva Acharei Hashoah. So that is a network of Holocaust survivors in the Greater Bay Area. Maybe she can explain if we ask her questions about what that really is. Then we have as a second panelist, Miss Beatrice Patsalidis, who also has a very mixed background. Some of the best psychologists come from different backgrounds, like literature, or economics, or music. And Miss Patsalidis is also a musician. She graduated from the Munich Conservatory. And she studied also languages, and she got she studied French literature and linguistics in Aix-en-Provence, and got her licence à lettres from Paris. What is particularly interesting is that she studied here at Sonoma State University between 1983 and 1986, and she wrote also a very interesting thesis, which is available, folks, at our library. It's called Revisiting Bluebeard's Castle, the Imaginal Legacy of the Nazi Genocide. So it should be. It's a wonderful thesis that really deals with today's subject matter. She is currently studying for her Ph.D. in psychology, and at the same time continues her interest in classical Persian music. So I'm very happy to ask you to come forward and to address us and to tell us something about your experiences. Thank you. Right.
Good evening. I feel very honored to speak in front of you today, as I've been in this auditorium myself about 6 years ago, and this question that was asked, guilt or responsibility, a contemporary German perspective, very intriguing for me, and I think that's why I accepted the invitation, because this question has been on my mind for many years, and I think that I spent most of my time here in Sonoma State thinking about that. I was first, I think, made sensitive to what it means to be German and to carry this historical legacy and memory with me when I was about 13 years old. And I remember I was traveling, I was sent to England, and I met an old lady who approached me and asked me, "Where do you come from?" And I said, "I come from Germany." And then she told me, "Well, I think you shouldn't be here. You know, your people inflict pain on our people, and I think it would be better for you to go home." And at the time didn't have anything to respond. Of course, I was shocked to hear that. And I was only vaguely familiar with the context that her remark referred to. I didn't know, at age 13, I didn't know very much about the Nazis and the killings of the Jews and the whole history. But I think that was a crucial moment for me to become very much aware of this German identity. And these kind of experiences kept repeating themselves as I traveled abroad. Sometimes, I would say, always by people who had gone through the war and who from the Germans would make this kind of remarks to me. And I remember very well the first time I came to Sonoma State, and after assisting to a course that I was taking, I went to the cafeteria and sat down with one of my classmates who was Jewish, and I think one of the first things he said to me, "Well, isn't that curious, we're sitting here together and your people made soap of my people." And that was the second time that I was speechless, because I had nothing to respond to that. I knew, well, this is true. And I think there is this dimension of speechlessness that we always encounter when we are confronted with reality. There's nothing to say about that. But of course, there's nothing to say doesn't spare us to try to understand what has happened, and I think that's probably why we are all here together, because we try to know more and to understand what happened. And somehow I think that this attempt makes us into citizens who have ethical conscience or consciousness. So I would like to express my gratitude towards the university, towards Sonoma State, and towards some people, teachers and students, who have helped me be able to really delve into this material that I attempted to study and to understand, and bear with all the mixed feelings and ambivalent reaction that came up in me. And I would like to especially thank one teacher who was very much helping me to do that, who passed away, and that was Gordon Tappan. I would also like to thank Bernd Jager, who was on my thesis committee. I would like to thank John Steiner, who with many dialogues and who helped me to understand much more from the inside the experience of the survivor. And also Tom Rosen, who I think is not here today, with who I also had many conversations. So, looking at the topic guilt or responsibility, the first thing I wanted to ask myself, well, what's the difference between guilt or responsibility? And I think that guilt is a kind of moral property that results from having committed a crime or a faulty act, and becoming conscious of this mistake or this wrongdoing, and then possibly come up with some kind of act of repentance or atonement, try to repair what has been destroyed. But I think I would speak of guilt only in terms of people who have actually committed the whatever this outrageous action was. And so I would be inclined to speak of guilt only in terms of the perpetrators themselves, not of the children of the perpetrators who were not really there when that happened. So I think the notion of collective guilt, especially if we look at that cross, generally poses some problems. I would then say, on the other hand, my generation, who I was born after the war, certainly has a responsibility. And now, what is this responsibility? I think we are responsible for any kind of racist thought or racist persecution that may manifest in our country. And I know very well that there is a lot of that. But the answer I would give, I would not. Guilt tends to be this kind of heavy weight on our shoulders that makes us withdraw and become very depressed and become very passive, and just, it's a kind of very introverted process in which I found myself for some time, but which in itself I don't think is very, very fruitful. On the other hand, responsibility really calls to action, that we have to do something. And responsibility also means that we have to respond. That's where the word comes from. We have to respond for something that has happened, for our history. And if I ask myself, well, to who do we have to respond? I would say, first of all, to the people, the dead, and the ones who survived. To those people, I think we owe some kind of response first. Now, what does this responsibility imply? I think that in organizing this lectures, we take some kind of responsibility. We try to understand what happened. We try to look more closely and study the political conditions, the socioeconomic conditions, the ideological conditions, and the religious and maybe pseudo-spiritual conditions that all were preparing the possibility of this genocide. And I think that the goal of this study is not so much only to dwell on the past and to remember just for the sake of remembering, but to avoid something similar to happen today. And similar in the sense that I think, as Bernd was about, racism is one crucial ingredient, so to speak, to the perpetration of this genocide. I think we have to try to become aware how racism originates in ourselves, in our contemporary society, anywhere we are, if it's here or somewhere else. And for that, I think we need to be very self-critical, because I think, as you pointed out, Bernd, that we all have the tendency to like to find ourselves together with those who are similar to us, and we don't like so much to share our intimacy with people who are very different. And so racism usually is built on stereotypes, and stereotypes come or present themselves if we don't really know what this other is like. There's a lot of ignorance in this perpetuation of stereotypes. And I also mentioned as this one of those preconditions for the Nazi genocide to happen was the ideology of the time. And what for me is very important, as I have traveled through different languages, is to look at language itself, because language is the carrier of an ideology. Ideology is embedded in, kind of takes its body in language, takes words and metaphors and symbols as a way to make itself public. So while looking, what I did in my part of my thesis, also looking at the language of the Third Reich, we noticed that the notion of racism was embedded in a very particular kind of language. And I will remember what Bernd said here the other day. He said racism exists only within a cultural frame that specifically includes a developed biological science and medicine. Racism misconstrues these sciences as valid guides to human ethical conduct and as revelations about the ultimate nature of mankind and the human world. End of quote. So the Nazi racism was based on a, I would rather say, a logistic notion of race, which was totally imaginary. I mean, this whole story of the purity of blood is a pseudoscientific idea. So, for me personally, it's important to point to two words or notions that disturbed me when I read the flyer that announced this lecture series, and maybe we can try to reflect together whether these words are really appropriate to express what we want to say. And one of these words is the word Holocaust itself, because Holocaust is a word that derives from the Greek and means literally a thing entirely burned. This thing entirely burned is used in a sacrificial context only. And in the Old Testament you can find in Genesis 22 that the word holocauston, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew word olah, is used for Abraham's sacrifice of his son Isaac. And it means, olah in Hebrew, the designation of sacrifice in which the victim is entirely burned. And there is a commentary by an anthropologist who says, in the Hebrew olah, as in the Greek Holocaust, the victim was burned in its entirety upon the altar or within the sacred place, without anything being taken away from it. I don't want to believe that the people who designed the flyers and I know that the word Holocaust is used constantly in English language, but I somehow don't want to believe that this murder of the Jews in the gas chambers was somehow on the same level as the victim that was burned on the altar. The gas chambers were not a sacred place, in my sense. And so I think it would be time that we stop using this word, because otherwise we falsify history. And we not only falsify history, but we really perpetrate Nazi ideology, because for the Nazis, they very much of the killings of the Jews as sacrifice. For them it was the sacrifice for the sake of the purity of the German blood. But if we continue to use this word, it is as if we buy into their ideology. And maybe we have to step back from our habits and think about where does the word come from, what does it mean, and is it appropriate? So I was making this point in my thesis already, because I think it's something very essential, and I don't think that we can just play with words as ever it pleases us, because words are not just shells to throw around, but words are containers of meaning. And the meaning of the word always from the root of the word and the original context in which the word is used. So I think for me, language is something, I consider language as something incredibly valuable. And so I think maybe we should ask ourselves, do we want to use language in this way? And know that there's a recent inflation of this word Holocaust, that I just came across a book written by a UC Berkeley sociologist about the American Indian Holocaust and survival. And I don't know, I think personally that it is very dangerous to compare one historical event to another, and in using this cost it becomes kind of brand name for any kind of genocide, and everybody's thrown in the same pot, and then it becomes all the same. And I think that's a very really laziness of our mind to try to do that. I don't think there is any comparison to the Nazi genocide, which was in its way of perpetration and in its historical conditions and in all the shape it took. It is a unique event, as is the American Indian genocide and as is any other genocide. They are unique events, and I would not try to put them on the same level. And also that Holocaust is a euphemism. That means it's a word that tries to present something in a more beautiful light than it actually is. It tries to hide some reality, that genocide was mass murder, was a very totally profane action. It had nothing to do with a sacred act. And using these kind of euphemisms is also something that the Nazis themselves were really masters of. And I think you know that speaking about the final solution of the Jewish question and the special treatment and all these words that were used to hide some cruel reality was very much part of why they were so successful in what they were doing, because nobody neither knew or asked, well, what does that really mean? What does that really mean, final solution or special treatment? And there's someone wrote a whole book, very interesting book on just the language of the Third Reich. It's called Lingua Tertii Imperii, which is a Latin title, but taking up all these, I mean, because the whole language, they had this notion of Sprachregelung, which means the regulation of language, and they had a whole, I mean, all these words that came to replace words that were too much revealing what the reality was. They were too much offensive for what they were doing. So my suggestion is to use the word Shoah, which means total destruction, which is a Hebrew word and which comes out much more of the Jewish community, not maybe so much in America, where there's some people who have written on this notion of whether to use Shoah or Holocaust. But I mean, evidently in Hebrew you wouldn't find the word Holocaust because it's a Greek and then English word. So that would be my suggestion, to think about that. And then the second thought I had, and I was really disturbed and asking myself, well, do I have the right to criticize the organizers of this lecture series, which in itself is so valid and I think it's so important for all of us, but at the same time, is this important for me, maybe especially as a foreign language who is very much attuned to words, to look at how this is presented. And when I read on the flyer that it says, study the disease of hate, prevent another epidemic of prejudice and genocide, I asked myself, well, why, how come that these people think that hate is a disease? Why is prejudice and genocide, why are they epidemics? What's that? And I thought that, well, if hate was a disease, it would be very easy to get rid of it. I just would take a pill or have some kind of injection or take some medication, and then it would be all gone. But unfortunately, I don't think it's so easy. I don't think that we can get rid of our hate so easily. I think hate is a very deeply rooted, very archaic human feeling that is present in everybody, that we have to work with and work through again and again, and that maybe some saint will be able one day to cure himself from, but I don't think that many of us could pretend to be at this place. So it seems to me that hate and love, they kind of condition each other, and to deny that there is, if we study this question, then we would get rid of our hate. I think it's too simple. I don't believe that. I think that if we look at the perpetrators of the Nazi genocide, from the most simple concentration camp guard to the man who put the bodies in the gas chamber, and the SS guards, I mean, they all lie on a human continuum, and we all are in this continuum and are potentially able to become these people, become torturers ourselves. I don't think that most of the SS, for example, were necessarily ill. I think that would be too easy to say, well, they're just crazy, and so they are so different from us that we don't really have anything to do with them. I think there is a very famous sociologist experiment known as the Milgram experiment that many of you probably know, and that shows how easily we all normal people can become this. So, coming back to the question whether hate is a disease, I think that's a very problematic choice of word. Now, so much I have criticized now a lot of these words, how this series is presented, that I want now to go back to the question about this guilt or responsibility. And when I thought about, giving a kind of contemporary German perspective, I realized that I hadn't really lived for a long time in Germany myself, and so I did a little research project and sent letters to people who I knew, who I vaguely knew, and wrote them this question and asked them, how would you respond to that? What's your spontaneous answer to this question? And I received one letter I received many letters, but this letter I want to read to you because I think it condenses a lot of contemporary German experience that is very much part of my own experience, and that become then very clear to you. So I will read you an excerpt of this letter. The woman, by the way, is 45 years old, and she was born in Germany. She lived pretty much all her life in Germany. So she writes, "What comes to mind concerning this topic of guilt or responsibility, a contemporary German perspective? I haven't yet talked about that with my family, as you had to do, because I feel some kind of hesitation that I cannot yet clearly identify. Curiously enough, I feel this hesitation much less outside of my family, with my friends, for example, or with strangers in a public forum. Do I adhere in this hesitation to my parents' traditional muteness, or is there another dynamic at stake? Do I protect myself in close relations in order not to be flooded? After the fact, I have the feeling as if I had contributed to my parents' silence, and that I sensed very clearly when I should stop asking. Of course, as a child, I do not want to see my parents shamed or helpless. I need them as good and strong parents. At the same time, the parents who were in their innermost distant and weighed down by feelings of shame and guilt needed their post-war children, who in turn had been spared from experiencing those evil times, in order to strengthen and rehabilitate themselves. The perfect symbiosis. So the children need the parents to be strong, and the parents need the children to be strong. We were, against all doubt, a good family. Somehow out there something terrible had happened, but that didn't have much to do with us. Of course we had to settle this somehow, and some curious or funny stories were at times circulating amongst us. Despite these inoffensive stories, I sensed, however, that something was not quite right, because I perceived that some family members became alienated from each other. It was only much later that I was told that a few family members were active Nazis, and that the gap between them, the ex-Nazis, and the rest of the family was never to be bridged again. During puberty, if not earlier, I got at last a split picture of the world. On the one side, the bourgeois family with its values, education, morality. On the other, the anguish and horror that I got to know through books, films, and other documentation. I was paralyzed. I could not match these two sides together. A feeling of craziness came over me, as if two realities were interpenetrating each other. The interpenetration of those two realities was ever present, not clearly distinct into past and present. It was like a reality behind reality, like a delusion, but no delusion at all. In bad times, I felt as if I was poisoned. From this moment on, the relationship with my parents, especially with my father, who was the representative of the external world, came to be covered and undermined by this other reality, especially because we were never able to talk about this. But how to talk about this? I didn't even have the words that would fit my experience. I suppose my father had felt this and suffered from it as well. Once he invited me, a totally unprecedented event, to watch the Hitler movie by Heuderberger with him. I think that he was hoping that we would be able to use this occasion as a way to start talking with each other. But it was impossible. We left each other without a word. The effect of this speechlessness, and many members of my generation have affirmed this experience, was totally disintegrating. Some people tried to resolve this tension within themselves, like I did, by feeling petrified, depressed, panicky. Some others tried to find a release in action by vehemently fighting the generation of their parents. The early terror to me prove an example of this. So I think that there are very, very important points that I think are attributable to most of us, of this generation after the war. There is this reloaded silence in our families that, especially if our fathers were not heroes of the resistance, and most of them I guess weren't, they would not talk about the past. It was as if there was a clear break in their lives between what they have lived before the war, and then the war, and then after the war. They tried to reconcile life. Many of them got remarried or changed their families, and really wanted to forget. And so the children, we as children, were very much inhibited to ask questions. We knew that something had happened, but we were not very much willing to ask these very, very uncomfortable questions, because we needed our parents wrong. I mean, who else do we have than our parents as kind of ideals to who we can identify as children? So if we have already parents that are very ambivalent in their own approach of life or in their ethical conduct, that's very, very hard for children to bear. Children cannot bear ambivalence, I mean, until they come to a certain age. Germany was very much prospering thanks to American aid and reconstruction, and Germans pretty much wanted to forget about what had happened before. And I think it's only very recently that there's some room in Germany for discussion about, you know, look what has happened during the Nazi period. That's very, to my sense, very recent. They much more rarely had important positions in this movement. And so we had this intuition that something was not quite right, and we became very suspicious, and we started to disbelieve, and we started to mistrust our fathers. And the whole father image for us was basically crushed. And there's a very good by a German sociologist, Alexander Mitscherlich, which is pretty well known also, who wrote about this fatherless society, that the fathers, the pre-war fathers, were no longer fathers after the war. There was no more ideal that we could rely on, that we were ashamed to be German. I mean, as I told you, these experiences, I was profoundly ashamed to be German and didn't know how to respond that. I think my own solution to this dilemma was that I left Germany when I was 19, and I moved to France and tried to re-adopt another identity. I tried to speak perfectly French, that nobody would recognize my accent, and would pretty much deny where I came from, and would feel also very distant from any Germans that I would encounter abroad, and try to not associate with them, and felt at the same time, had very mixed feelings, felt very alienated and very, very much isolated and distant from Germans, and also very contemptuous about how, I mean, how had they been able to do that was always in my mind. And of course I cannot say how I would have acted in the same situation. I don't know. And that was, but the dilemma was that we could not talk about that. And how much time do we have? 42. Okay. In terms of my education, I think I'm a little bit different, because I'm born in '57, so not exactly immediately after the war. And I was my education when I went to high school was very much open. I had a history teacher who was very critical and who gave us a lot of material to study the Nazi period. But I know that people before that that didn't even appear in the history. So the history books, I think, stopped with Bismarck. That was German history. And of course, that there were no Jews in Germany to talk with. I did not meet one single Jew growing up in Germany. I mean, they had, most of them, there are not many living there now, and most of them had left, of course, or were dead. So, what for me, the incredible, I could not understand how my parents had witnessed all, you know, the destruction of the Jewish shops and the burning of the synagogues and the disappearance of the Jews from neighborhoods and schools and the disappearance of their friends, and then all of a sudden everything was gone, and they did never talk about it again. There were no scars, so to speak, on their body. They were just trying to give us this economically prosperous German image. And always I remember the question that I addressed to my father and other people of his generation. Well, how come you did not know? You must have known the existence of the camps. And everybody said, no, we only knew after the war. And so there was, I never could understand how that could be possible. And I think there is a remaining incredible suspiciousness and disbelief that stayed with me up till this day. And I think that this doubtful attitude of which, I mean, I had to give you some kind of sample today, even in looking at these notions and words. I see that also as part of my responsibility. And even it's not a very pleasant thing to do, but I think that I have to do that. Thank you.
So I would like to describe to you the process of my own awakening. And my story is different in that for me it happened much later. Like Beatrice, you know, you were almost like confronted with this when you were in your teenage years. And for me it basically happened more or less when I was about 30 years old. So that I awoke to the legacy of the Nazi past, really. So I will talk briefly about the milieu that I grew up in, and then also talk about the detours that it took me. And that means I will talk, for example, about my involvement in the student movement. So now, keep in mind when I talk that I will talk mostly about the 70s, because I left Germany in 1981, and so I basically can talk only, you know, about this period of my life, because later, you know, I don't know so exactly, I don't follow exactly what's going on today. It wouldn't be authentic. So I grew up in a little village in Bavaria, and most of my school years I spent actually in convent schools, because in this area there were no other schools, and so this happened even though my parents weren't religious at all. My father had inherited a small carpentry business from his father, and he put all his efforts into turning this into a sizable lumber company. Now, until about age 15, I hardly ever heard anything about the genocide of the Jews, you know, at school, for example. So my history teacher, for example, would talk about the persecution of the Jews during the Third Reich, and he would say, yes, the Jews were harassed and the synagogues were burned down, but then actually many Jews fled to other countries. And so the context could guess in religious instruction. So I heard there about the bad Jews who shouted, "Crucify him." And also, worse yet, I heard about Judas. But then something happened that changed my image of the Jews. I was a passionate violinist when I was in my teenage years, and one day I discovered Yehudi Menuhin, the famous violinist. And I found a record of his, and I listened to this record intensely in every free minute that I had. And what happened one day, an aunt of mine came to our house, and so she found me there listening to this record, and she commented to the other people around her, "He's a Jew." So I heard, he's a Jew. The way how she said it sounded it's like something out of the ordinary. It definitely was different as if she had said, he's an American or he's an Italian. So was there something wrong with being a Jew? Well, my conclusion at that point was that I thought never, ever could anything be wrong with Yehudi Menuhin. But I thought maybe something is wrong about my aunt, she's weird. So 1 year later, I had the opportunity to listen to Yehudi Menuhin in a concert in London. And being in London, at this time I was about 13, you know, away from my parents' house, away from the convent school, and breathing the international spirit of this big city made me feel, you know, this is where I would like to live. I would like to get out of Germany. And I wanted as soon as I had finished school. But actually, once I had finished school, I went on to the University of Munich, and I started out with studying business administration. Because, you know, my parents had wanted that I should maybe later take over their business. But very soon I felt that studying business wasn't really for me, because I felt that the horizon of this subject was a bit too narrow for me. It didn't really answer my questions that I really had about the economy. So I wanted to find out, you know, how come that the third world countries are always getting poorer, and how come, you know, the rich nations get always richer. But so this interest actually then led me to get involved with the leftist student movement. Now, the student movement had begun in Germany in 1967 and had its climax in 1998. And at the time when I got involved, it actually had already ebbed away to a certain degree. That means especially as far as mass participation was concerned. But also in terms of the content, it changed. Because first, the student movement had been something like a anti-authoritarian movement, but at that time, in the early 80s, it had already turned into some kind of a movement of smaller leftist groups that were having feuds among each other. And of course, there was always this fringe phenomenon of terrorism. Now, even though the big mass demonstrations against, for example, the visit of the Shah of Iran and the Vietnam War were the catalysts originally for the student movement, the anti-authoritarian movement had initially evolved out of the uneasiness of this young student generation with their parents' somnambulist attitudes towards the Nazi past, and basically with their state of normalcy, you know, with their being at peace with this Nazi past, and also tendency to sweep everything under the rug that would disturb, you know, their being very busy, you know, in promoting and worshipping the so-called economic miracle. Now, also this protest was directed against the hypocrisy with which German institutions, especially also the university, claimed an unbroken and untainted connection to the century-old traditions. I remember, for example, that one of the banners that the protest movement carried said, "Unter den Talaren ist der Mief von 1000 Jahren." And that meant under the academic gowns is hidden the stench of 1,000 years. Now, unfortunately, the inquisitive direction of this student movement got lost very quickly. The urge to re-examine the Nazi past and to reproach society for smoothing over its brittle foundation and to challenge the older generation into discussion gave more and more way to more or less rigidified and dogmatic forms of student and leftist politics, and then, of course, in the late 70s to the ecology movement and to the Greens. Now, from today's perspective, as I look at the leftist movement and this leftist direction that ensued from the student movement I look at it as a protest against distortions of history in post-war Germany. And what I mean by this is that the establishment that of course controlled the media, they practiced some selective memory of the past. And so they evoked only the memory of the famous resistance fighters such as von Stauffenberg and von Beck, all these military figures who had, made these attempts of getting rid of Hitler and the others, or maybe they would talk about the White Rose. But there was never any mentioning of any, let's say, communist or social democratic resistance. And it is remarkable that even well-known social democrats such as Willy Brandt or Herbert Wehner, who was then the speaker of the Social Democrats in the Bundestag, they would never, they really kind of kept a low profile on their past during the Nazi time. So Brandt was in exile in Norway and Wehner was a communist actually. So in Germany, these facts were very unpopular, and you could not create significant political following by mentioning such personal facts of these people's history. So the remnants of the student movement reclaimed the suppressed memory by identifying with the pre-war leftist movement and by certain people who went in exile, like theoreticians, for example, the people of the Frankfurt School, such as Adorno, Horkheimer, Kruse. Now, I do by no means do I want to say that this was a bad mistake. I mean, heaven forbid. I think it was, in terms of the contents, this was very good theory. But I think, from my point of view today, I think it was an easy way out, because what we did was, our identification with our heroes enabled us, on the one hand, to take a clean slate. In a way, this was our Stunde Null. And so on the other hand, by adopting these new father figures, we were able to trash our own fathers. And so I think this was maybe a necessary first step, but it was not sufficient because it did not help us to resolve our entanglement, our emotional entanglement with our fathers, nor with the milieu that they grew up in. So identifying with this leftist resistance to the Nazi gave us the ability to assume a position of moral superiority over our parents. And I think the danger in this attitude was that we paid the high emotional detachment and again perpetuated the historical amnesia. Now, one of the symptoms of this condition was the love for abstract theory. And even the way how Marx was studied and interpreted was very abstract and completely devoid of historical perspective. Now, when it came to political action, you could see in such slogan as when, for example, Israel was condemned for its treatment of the Palestinians in a very passionate way. And the naive identification with the PLO at this time actually made me already feel uneasy. But I was not able to recognize this as some kind of a symptom. So at that point, and I wasn't able to draw any conclusions. So at that point, my own response was rather evasive, and I kind of made a big circle around this whole Mideast problem. I just basically avoided thinking about this whole thing altogether. So in this respect, I woke up only after I came to the United States. Within days of my arrival, I felt a Jewish presence here. And this happened by, finding leaflets flyers that called people to events in the Jewish community. Or I saw a building with a Star of David on it. And I met a group of Israelis at a party. And when I saw them, I felt like I want to sink into the ground. And I asked myself, what would they ever want to have to do with me? So now I understood that, I started to understand post-war Germany was befallen by a taboo of not mentioning or touching anything Jewish in our daily lives, regardless of the official philo-Semitism, you know, on the level of government institutions. Now I realized that the Nazis not only had killed so many Jews, millions, but that they also had proactively, you know, eliminated the memory of those whom they murdered, and along with it, the Jewish culture. I was shocked to admit myself that I, in a way, had complied with this, and that the leftists in no way had prevented me from doing this. So the German left was indeed not able to tackle dealing with the genocide of the Jews, but rather complied wiping out the memory of Auschwitz. And this could easily be recognized in the use of language, when in very rare references to the Nazi past, the left would call it fascism, and would not use the word would not use the word National Socialism. So clearly, this type of language again devoided history in its true content, in that it belittled anti-Semitism as its main driving force, as the main driving force of Nazi terror. So using the word fascism enabled us to compare, you know, the Nazi terror to other dictatorships, and thus, of course, relativizing the German atrocious deed. Even criticizing the United States in this context enabled us to behave as iconoclasts, smashing our parents' newly emerged idol. But more than that, I think our accusing the United States of atrocities against civilians also served the purpose of deflecting from our own load of guilt, or better, from the load of guilt that we inherited from our fathers. So this tendency to find other nations as perpetrators became actually even more pronounced at the time of the Israelis' invasion of Lebanon in 1982. In this year, in the summer, I went back to Germany, and I was horrified to find in the leftist and in the green press the image of that now the Israelis were portrayed as the new Nazis, and who inflicted a Holocaust on the Palestinians in Beirut. So the slogans called for the Palestinians to fight to the last bullet. And in other words, they encouraged the Palestinians to take on a maximalist position and totally disregarding any options for negotiations. Now, it's also interesting that at this time, conjuring up this equation of Israelis as Nazis made it into the mainstream media talk. So it was no longer a leftist fringe phenomenon. So it became quite clear that this emerging enthusiasm for blaming other nations was an attempt on the part of many Germans to recover their lost innocence. In a way, the left and the Greens espoused now a position that had some resemblance with some of the positions of the right-wing historians in the Historiker Streit, when they, like, for example, Nolte, when he points out that, the Germans did really only copy the atrocious deed of the Bolsheviks. All of this could be seen as a symptom of the desperate struggle for normalization throughout the 80s in Germany. And these were attempts to shed once and forever the oppressive cloak of the Nazi legacy. Now, recognizing my own meddling in the muddy waters of anti-Americanism and avoidance, all of this, this brought me closer to home again. It dawned on me that what I really had tried to hide you know, for my own conscious recognition was the shame about my parents and all other Germans for not having been able to free themselves from the Nazis, but that in a way outside powers had to come and do the job. And I recognized in myself a childish desire for parents who would have been able to recognize what the Nazis did, the full extent of it, and who would have been able to just get rid of the Nazis and commit some heroic deeds. Without doubt, I was now faced with needing to explore my own connection to the genocide of the Jews. And that meant for me to find what was my father's role in all of this. While I grew up, the relationship with my father was very complicated. And until I was about 30, there was never really any significant dialogue between the two of us. So I sensed more and more that his adrenalized lifestyle and his inapproachability was really a cover for inner restlessness and maybe for a torment. So especially in the weeks before his death, haunting memories of the war came back to him. So he told me clearly that he found out about the deportations and the murder of the Jews when he was a soldier at the Eastern Front in Romania. He said that this became particularly clear in one instance when he was in a small town called Brailer, where he had gotten friendly with some people in the town. And he said there were rumors that the Jews would be taken away. And he was not there when it happened, but he came back a few days later. So when he found out that all the Jews of the town were missing, he burst out screaming, "This war is cursed, this war is..." He said that from this moment he lost his faith, and he said that he was gripped with a pervasive sense of unfoundedness, and this was something he never could regain again. So he knew he was part of a machinery, and the only way to get out of it would have been to run over to the other side. But he considered deserting, but he did not do it. So he ended up trying to save his own life. And I'm glad that he saved his own life, even though I think maybe he could have saved it by going over to the other side. But maybe he would not have saved it by going over to the other side. I'm very glad that he saved his life. And I think that my question about, could he have done this or could he have done that is almost like a childish question. But I certainly ask myself what I would have done in his situation. I know one thing for sure, and that is that I do not want to claim moral superiority over my father any longer, because I was never faced with such a tough choice. Of course, I would like to think about myself as being heroic, but I know that there is no guarantee for this. Thank you.
So now you're open for some questions? Yes?
Yeah.
All right. Well? Yes, go ahead.
Okay. During the presentation of the first panelist, I was quite disturbed about English language or any other language evolved. In America today, in those three books, there are secular definitions that have nothing to do with sacrifice and religion. And I would like to read them, and then you can make up your own mind.
Mm-hmm.
Webster's, complete or thorough, sacrifice or by fire. Oxford, they're a little bit snooty here. Complete destruction by fire, or that which is consumed, complete destruction, especially of a large number of persons. And then they go one step further, which is debatable, a great slaughter or massacre. But there's a secular definition of the word Holocaust, small h, and that means destruction by fire. Now, if the German lexicographers have a problem in translating this word into German, that's something you have to deal with. But to us who speak American here, Holocaust, small h, is destruction by fire. And it can be things as well as, unfortunately, people. And I leave it up to the German people themselves how to make the translation. I don't know, is there a German word for destruction by fire? Dr. Steiner? No. Anybody? Is there?
No, you know,
Well, but
Secular destruction by fire. If you say so, I don't know.
Zerstörung durch Brand. Sure, there's a word. You can say
yeah, but see, that's totally misses the point.
by fire, but it's not a direct translation.
Yeah, just good. Just
any more than the English word destruction by fire. It's
Well, Holocaust. Well, no, it's in American, it's a from that old root. But it's a definition. That's the definition.
Okay, let's see.
American, and I thought it was an extremely interesting point, and I think it's somewhat ironic that given that Holocaust does have religious and sacrificial implications, that the Jews, or the extermination of the Jews, would be labeled with such a word.
It's in the
And I
dictionary.
think it's extremely
There's a historical root. There's a historical root, yes, involved with sacrifice. But a modern interpretation, a modern use of that word, secular, completely secular, is destruction by fire.
Good. I think you've made your point. Yes, sir.
Beatrice, would you address the question of why Shoah might be a better label for what went on in Germany between 1941 and 1945, rather than why not to use the word Holocaust? A little bit about the history of the attempt of Claude Landesman and some other people in Israel to use the word Shoah rather than Holocaust.
Well, I think that first of all, the word Shoah comes from the Jewish community itself, so I would take that as a very strong proof that that should be the word that is used, that is without ambivalence. I think the problem is that the word Holocaust does carry ambivalence, and as you mentioned, it is. I mean, the definitions in the dictionaries are not univocal. I mean, they differ also. So why introduce an ambivalence when we don't really have to introduce an ambivalence? And both of these words are foreign terms. It's not an American term, neither Shoah nor Holocaust. But in this case, I think I would prefer to turn to the Jewish community to ask them, well, what do you want to speak about that? No Jew who is conscious about choosing words or who speaks Hebrew would use the word Holocaust, I think. And that's for me the only reason that is valuable. I don't need the random dictionary.
Yeah, I think the problem, while using the word Holocaust is also that because it doesn't, there's this euphemistic, connotation in it. I think this is what disturbs me mostly about it, and that the other word, the Shoah, says very clearly it's total destruction, it's total devastation.
And as far as I know, the Jews were not killed by fire, by the way. They were killed by gas. In their majority.
They were genocide.
Yes. Ovens were gas ovens.
No, they were not.
I mean, they were shot and they were burned, but I think, when you speak about the murder of the Jews, you usually speak about the gas chambers, not about fire.
Yes, ma'am.
I thought that was really interesting. The first Prerequisite, you said that when you were in school, German history ended with...
No, I was speaking about the generation before me. I was making the difference between me and, for example, her generation.
Yeah.
So,
perhaps I misunderstood, but it made me think of the fact that I'm 21, and I went, through 11th grade, and I never learned about Vietnam. Never. It was never, ever discussed in school. So it's not just, the Germans or the whoever's have
definite programs,
Yes.
In those schools. I know this for sure that especially in the 80s a lot changed. And I know, for example, that there was an excellent program, I guess it was maybe about 2 years ago, in the adult education section of the Munich Volkshochschule, like this adult education program, with, giving a lot of courses, not only about the destruction of the Jews, but also about Jewish community, Jewish culture, relationships with Israel. So there was done a lot in the 80s, I think.
Yeah, I would like to respond partially to the suggestion that the history of Vietnam is not taught in contemporary public schools. It's certainly taught these days in junior high school, because my junior high school son brings home his junior high school teacher's view of it, and his teacher and I are having a discussion via my son. But that's just to thank Sarah for talking about some of the methods of avoidance that the Germans were using in the 70s. I found that very illuminating. I was in Germany in the 70s for a year in Freiburg, and I noticed a lot of what you were talking about, but hadn't made the connections you were making. My question is, can you suggest some of the ways in which Americans, having been here now as an observer, are doing something similar to that, with maybe slavery or our... I don't want to pin you down to do that. I mean, like, you've been here long enough, and everybody's been extrapolating from the German experience of the Holocaust, and I thought I would ask you, since you gave some fine details of your experience in Germany. If you don't want to do that, say no.
No, I mean, I'd have to think about it. I mean, I can't now have the, the big speech about this, how it is done.
I'll see you later, and I'll ask you.
I'd like to make a comment. I had some friends that have lived here, of my generation, and much to the consternation of everybody, moved to settle in Freiburg for a while. They died of natural causes recently, because most of us couldn't subscribe to it. But the lady of the house very much bought the line of the Greens, the Grünen, and, kept of, let's say, peaceful resolution of conflicts, of forgetting to do it the Neanderthal way, as we even just very recently did something. I mean, it may have been necessary at the time, but so many things were done wrong leading up to Saddam Hussein's existence that then finally we had to go back to the club method, except that we used modern machinery. So I see in part of the German intelligentsia a very welcome movement toward generalizing the experience of the Holocaust and see, now look, we got to do something about what's going on in this entire world, in our relationship between each other personally, between climbing off the book. So
Yes.
far.
Yes.
I was wondering what the contemporary position of the Jews in Germany are, and what the attitude is towards
The contemporary position of the German Jewry today?
an attitude of the society towards the Jews.
Okay. You want to repeat it? Okay. The question is, what is the contemporary, what is the attitude of the contemporary? I mean, they know how to behave themselves, and they are friendly, and they are philosemitic, and they try very hard to do all kinds of things. And now they try, for example, to restore the old synagogues and make museums from it. We may have some ambivalent feeling about that. But there are also tendencies, for example, that, I mean, I heard one discussion in Munich about 2 years ago or so, where they talked about, this tendency of, making all these museums out of these former Jewish institutions. And they said, it's amazing. Somebody in the Jewish community actually responded and said, it's amazing that, yeah, they are doing this and they make big efforts, but they never include us in their planning. They do it for them, they do it perfectly, but they never do it with us. And that actually, there's still this, I think, on a very level, this inability to touch Jews. I mean, to be close to them. They can't be normal. I mean, that's really the problem, I think. That, and I think that also, that on a, more like, of course, we have intelligentsia, we have a part of the intelligentsia that are, very enlightened, and they understand, if you look at the Historikerstreit, are decent people who understand, how history is distorted and what kind of function this has. But if you look, at the larger crowds, there are still a whole lot of anti-Semitism out there. And it's crazy because there are not many Jews in Germany, but it is there. It's like a folk, some kind of a folk, folk culture or something like that, I would say. Let's say, for example, if I remember these things, hiking in the mountains, in the evening when you find people singing, they sing all kinds of anti-Semitic stuff. I mean, or, whatever SS songs or stuff like that. You find these things still in the village inn. When people get a bit drunk, they will do these things. And I think this, and also, as John Steiner last time, said, if you look at the jokes, I mean, these things are right out there, and they are still there, and they are not going to go anytime soon, unfortunately.
Okay. Yeah, Mr. Brown, yeah. Is there any significant difference between the way young German men your age would see the Holocaust and the way women see it?
I don't know. I can't answer the question.
You haven't talked to...
I talk to men, but I know some men who have very good positions. I couldn't say that there's a gender difference. But of course, I ran into guys who are very self-righteous and very quickly come up with this. Look at the others. Look at what the others are doing. I mean, this is the very widespread tendency, especially now.
Okay. Yes, sir.
I very much appreciate you talking about the word Holocaust, and I wasn't quite clear on it. But
Can you speak up, please?
I very much appreciate that you pointing out about the word Holocaust and how metaphors and how we create words and what power words do have. And as a survivor, I don't feel that my parents and my family were sacrifices. They were victims. But that is not to say that many people, knowing what was happening, that they willingly sacrificed themselves to go with their children or with their whatever. But I do resent the fact that we're being presented as big sacrifice. The other side of it is also true that many of the SS and other helpers they had who were not Germans at all came from a heavy Christian background with a hatred of Judaism, and that they believed they were doing a mitzvah for the Führer in killing a Jew.
Yeah, well, yes.
What Jean pointed out at the beginning about Saddam Hussein in Iran publishing that thing, that the Elders of Zion and other anti-Semitism existed for such a long time, no wonder they came forth. They were being created and created and created, and it just happened.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, and I learned about the whole pseudo-spiritual background of Nazism, which was very important by the work of John Steiner, who wrote about that in different articles himself. And I think that's something that is not so much known in the general public and history, that they had these, pseudo-religious meetings with exercises and indoctrinations and German. I mean, there was a mixture of, you know, it was kind of syncretism of different religions, actually.
What do you use and say to people instead of using the word Holocaust? Because then I say Shoah.
Yeah.
What is that? Well, it's like I got to back it up with something.
Well, I would say genocide. That you don't have another word, you know. That means the murder of a people.
Yeah, I'd just like to comment. Like in Germany, at least at least one talks about. At least one talks about, let's say, the mass murder of the Jews. I think that would be, you know, I think it's important that in Germany that they, you know, don't try to whatever euphemize or whatever this, you know. So it says more what it is.
Yes.
You touched about the presentation. As you come off as descendants from this thing, you're descendants of, and you're not participants in the process. How do you? I'm a little confused about the focus of this particular presentation, because the title happens to guilty and guilt. I'm wondering how each of you perceives who is guilty and where does responsibility really lie. I don't see either of you as guilty in any sense. I never have perceived that problem in that fashion. Who is guilty? Where does responsibility lie?
Well,
Can you repeat the question?
Hardly.
I think the gentleman says that for him it was not quite clear where does the guilt lie and where does the responsibility start, and somehow he didn't get the real sense of, from our presentations, you know, the difference between these two notions. And I think I had tried, maybe I wasn't very successful making it clear that from my perspective is the guilt is attributable to the perpetrators. And of course, who
are they? I'm getting.
Who are the perpetrators?
Yeah.
Well, I think that.
It occurred to me that it was either of you.
Well, maybe we have to look at different degrees of perpetration. I mean, there were, you know, the whole hierarchy of the, starting with the SS and then the Nazi party, and those who were active Nazis, who were members of the party, who helped to organize the perpetrator and who is not. But I think it's for me, a line that needs to be drawn between the generations. That is, of the war, the generation who was, let's say, adult before and during the war, and the generation that was born or child after the war. And I think that the responsibility is to attempt to understand. I mean, that's what we try to study, to know more, to have some kind of self-critical perspective on our own racist attitudes, and you know how are we confronted with this question of racism today? And I think we are confronted with it every day in some ways. And the responsibility is to be aware, to become.
Yeah, I'll try to answer this for myself, and I think that the guilt, in a way, I mean, I look at myself, you know, how it all happened for me, and the guilt for me has some internal reality in that it is represented by the connection to my father. That, you know, towards the end of his life, I realized, you know, how much guilt he had, and that this is something in a way because I think I was emotionally very close with him, even though it was very difficult, but it's something that I also took on emotionally. And that I think this is something in my present life that has a certain, you know, that I need to give a certain external reality, that I have to kind of externalize it also in terms of the work that I'm doing, for example, that I take the personal responsibility. I say I have to be on the side of the victims, and I have to do something about it. And that's my...
All this self-revelation is very key to me, but I think the problem is even more abstract than that, and it's even broader than that.
Yeah.
But I thought that was extremely touching, that revelation.
Okay. Yes, sir.
I think that part of the problem is that much of this issue, I think, is viewed in a static sense, as you brought out. The story is changing and becoming reinterpreted, specifically in Germany with Nolte and the Historikerstreit. And what's happening is, between the two camps, the functionalists and intentionalists, the functionalists are gaining the upper hand, and that tends to bring out that the circle of accomplices who actually perpetrated the deeds is drawing ever smaller. And as this trend progresses, I think
reality, and so I don't kind of care about what the historians say, you know, because this is what I know, and that's my truth, and that's my reality, and that's what I have to deal with.
But even he is unsure precisely what was going on.
No, he was sure.
Well, not in detail.
Like he heard rumors, and he knew they were gone, and he had definitely a sense of it.
But he had no direct knowledge.
He didn't know
exactly
about what Majdanek was all about, of course not, but yeah, you know.
That's the point.
Like me, are you going to someone that's dead and here is the daughter?
No, not at all. I'm just pointing out that even his guilt was in a sense indirect.
It's abstract.
Was
Okay.
it not? I believe
Okay, let's have one more.
Yeah.
Let's have one more question.
In
Yes.
50 words or less, let us know what you intend to do to make present Germany, next generation, a kinder, gentler nation. By eliminating, for example, hate of foreigners, like the Turks, today the Turks understand, or the Greeks. What would you suggest to get them on to the state of enlightenment in which you are today?
That's a good
But
one
I
to
think
end
that's a very, very tough question. But personally, I think that the only thing I can do is foreigners, which is definitely present. Yeah. I think that's an impossible task. I think the only work can happen in very small circles.
Good. Well, thank you very much.